Italy today was hardly recognizable because it was also divided among the many kingdoms of Europe. But we begin to see Europe's nation states taking shape. And in the 16th century, it is Spain which becomes the indisputable lead power by accident, of course, partly the accident of marriage, because through marriage, through the marriage of the son of Maximilian with the daughter of Isabella, the issue of that marriage, Charles becomes king of Spain and inherits through the Habsburg line also the control of the Low Countries. But the bigger accident, of course, was Christopher Columbus's miscalculation in sailing east and not discovering the route to India, but instead discovering an entire two continents in between and giving Spain the first hold on the New World, a first in transoceanic empire. And so the wealth and the riches of Spain became unparalleled as the gold and silver flowed in from the new colonies of the Americas. But we know that the Spanish rule dissipated that wealth in endless wars, wars with the Low Countries that eventually led to the independence of the Netherlands, wars throughout Europe, and wars with the rising power of France itself. If the 1500s or the 16th century was the age of Spain, the next century, the 1600s, if the 1500s, the 16th century was really the age of Spain, the next century, the 1600s, that is the 17th century, was a century of transition because it was a century of war. War in part that had started when Martin Luther lit the fuse on religious wars by launching the Reformation with his 95 Theses tacked on the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, because by the 17th century, from 1618 to 1648, non-stop war, the 30 Years' War in Europe, part religious, part territorial, and wars with the Ottomans, still threatening to take Vienna as late as 1683. So the 17th century was a century of transition, and the 30 Years' War was a key moment. It dramatically weakened the power of the Habsburgs. It was a bitter and brutal war, but it was also part of the transition to where we are today, because in the last years of the 30 Years' War, in came France to get a piece of the action, as it were, a war of choice for France in the face of a weakened Habsburg rule, because the French kings saw the Habsburgs as their competitors. And so France was able to gain territorial advantage by entering the war actually on the Protestant side, as it were, in the final years of the 30 Years' War. Well, that brings us to Louis XVI, because Louis XVI was born in 1638. He became king, though with a regency, not really ruling under his own authority, in 1643. That is in the final years of the 30 Years' War. And he would rule for an unbelievable 72 years until 1715, the Sun King. And this was the period when France became the central power of Europe. Why the central power? Well, on the one side, the Ottoman attacks from the east and the 30 Years' War had weakened the Austrian Habsburgs, which were the great rivals of France to the east. And the wars that the Spanish Habsburgs fought and their attempts to defend their new empire weakened the Spanish to France's southwest. And so the skies opened up for the Sun King, and France was in a position to become the main power of Europe. Now, part of the reason is that the territorial gains that the French kingdom had won over the centuries meant that this was the most populous kingdom of Europe. Already in the 1600s, there were nearly 20 million people in France, and this was much larger than the Spanish kingdom, much larger than the Holy Roman Empire. So population alone and the fertility of a large land area with fertile agriculture and in the center of increasing commercial trade in Europe gave a foundation for France's power. And no doubt that was a major part of the story, simply being the third most populous nation in the world in the 1600s, far behind China and India, but ahead of the German lands in the Holy Roman Empire, or Britain, or Spain, meant that France had the basis for military power and the basis for projecting national power ahead of the rivals. But of course, power is also achieved by consolidation of power in a state. And Louis XIV, if nothing else, was the master of consolidating power. Perhaps he was shaken early on by events that took place in the 1650s in France, because no sooner had he reached an age of maturity, but there was a rebellion in France called the Fronde, and this was a rebellion that included the nobility and other classes of society, and Louis XIV put it down ruthlessly. It is said that this was a rebellion taking place in Paris that actually physically threatened Louis XIV and his family. It left no love for Paris, apparently, for Louis XIV, so he thought he'd move a little bit away and establish a court here in Versailles that would be grand and perhaps a little bit safer than Paris. And judging by what happened soon after in the end of the 18th century, that judgment about Paris certainly has some merit. That's a story we'll get to soon enough. So Versailles became the center of the court, and Louis XIV prided himself on creating a military empire and a administrative centralization that would live up to the self-appellation of the Sun King. He appointed a very good finance minister, and as an economist, I always appreciate that. Colbert remains in history as one of the most effective finance ministers who reformed the state, who raised tax revenues, who provided a financial basis for the French growing empire, and that was part of the consolidation of Louis XIV's power. He brought the nobility here partly to hold them hostage, quite clearly. This was the court at Versailles, but it was also the place where he could watch those who might have some thoughts contrary to the absolutism that Louis XIV sought and essentially achieved. Of course, he is famously attributed as saying, "L'État, c'est moi," the state, it is I. Of course, he didn't say it. These expressions are too good to be true sometimes, and this one is one of those. But it's so good that it encapsulates his idea, even though it was written into the script in the 19th century. It's an apocryphal statement, but it does express Louis XIV's idea about power. Now, at the end of the 17th century, in fact, the very end, in the year 1700 itself, Charles II of Spain, after a long rule by an incapacitated king, died without an heir, and that launched a war, the War of Spanish Succession. And France, being the most powerful nation of the day, aimed to install the next king of Spain. The Habsburgs, the competitors, also aimed to hold a Habsburg line in Spain, and a war ensued over the next 13 years. It went back and forth, but in the end, the French got their way in the bottom line, because Spain became a Bourbon monarchy, that is, a monarchy in the same family as Louis XIV, albeit with a monarch who renounced any rights to unify the Spanish and French houses thereafter. But still, now Europe was ruled by the Bourbons, by the powerful French state, and by the Bourbon line in Spain. One might think, well, that's the end of the story. We now have France as effectively the powerful ruler of Europe, and end of the story is the French king and his kingdom dominating ever after. But what we know to be true is that this remarkable period of French power would only last in French domination essentially for another century. During the 1700s, there was increasing competition among these rising states of Europe, especially Britain and France, now in competition with each other, including in competition for colonies in the Americas and in Asia. Holland is part of the competition. The German states, still under Habsburg rule, continue to be part of the competition. And the 18th century continues to be an age of war, as these competing nations, becoming more centralized, more clearly modern nation states, are in constant jostling, shifting of alliances, and outright war with each other.